Eliza Carter stared at the dust cloud trailing behind her uncle's horse-drawn wagon as it vanished into the crimson horizon. The 14-year-old's knees gave way beneath her threadbare skirt as the terrible reality crashed through her. He wasn't coming back. The merciless New Mexico sun beat down upon her copper hair as tears carved clean paths through the dust on her freckled cheeks. She was alone, completely alone on the edge of Apache territory, abandoned to die by the only family she had left. In this world, worthless burden, Thomas Carter had snarled before shoving her from the wagon and tossing her small bundle of possessions after her. "The Apaches can have you. One less mouth to feed." His final words hung in the dry desert air as the wagon disappeared over the ridge, leaving his orphaned niece to whatever fate awaited her in this savage land. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But something burned beneath Eliza's. Fear and despair, a fierce ember her uncle hadn't managed to extinguish despite years of cruelty. She would survive. She had to. What Eliza couldn't possibly know was that she wasn't as alone as she believed. From the shadow of a distant mesa, watchful eyes had witnessed everything. The unforgiving afternoon sun scorched Eliza's pale skin as she gathered her meager possessions. A thin blanket, a dented canteen half full of stale water, a small knife with a chipped blade, and her mother's silver locket containing a faded portrait of parents she barely remembered. They had died of fever 3 winters ago, leaving her at the mercy of an uncle who saw her only as another burden on his struggling homestead. Her parched lips cracked as she surveyed the barren landscape, stretching endlessly in every direction. To the east lay the territory she had traveled from, where her uncle would be spreading lies about her disappearance or death. To the west and north rose the foreboding mountains where Apache raiding parties were said to descend from. To the south lay nothing but desert as far as the eye could see, Eliza's stomach clenched with hunger. It had been nearly 2 days since her uncle had allowed her more than a few scraps of stale bread. Her head pounded from thirst and the relentless heat. She uncorked the canteen, allowing herself the smallest sip, knowing that finding water would determine whether she lived to see another sunrise. "Think, Eliza," she whispered to herself, her mother's practical voice echoing in her memory. "Find shade first, then water. You can't survive this heat." A scattered stand of juniper trees and rocks about a half-mile distant offered the only promise of shelter. Eliza gathered her bundle and began walking, each step stirring dust that clung to her sweat-dampened skin and clothes. The coarse wool of her dress scratched against her sunburned shoulders, but she pushed forward, focusing on the junipers rather than the growing dizziness that threatened to overwhelm her. By the time she reached the sparse shade, her vision swam, with dark spots. She collapsed against the largest rock, gasping for breath in the stifling air. The eastern sky had begun to darken, not with approaching night, but with ominous thunderheads. In the desert, rain could be both salvation and doom, a source of precious water, but also of deadly flash floods. The rumble of distant thunder matched the growling of her empty stomach. Eliza scanned the ground for anything edible. Prickly pear, yucca roots, anything her mother had taught her to recognize during their brief time on the frontier. Her gaze fell upon a small clump of prickly pear cactus growing between 2 rocks. The red fruits on top might provide both nourishment and moisture. Using her small knife, she carefully sliced off several of the spiny fruits and scraped away the needles as best she could. The sweet, seedy pulp filled her mouth with blessed moisture, temporarily quieting the worst of her thirst. But she knew it wouldn't be enough, not nearly enough to survive more than a day in this wilderness. As shadows lengthened across the rocky ground, Eliza worked to create some form of shelter. Her mother's stories about frontier survival had always emphasized protection from the elements. Desert days brought scorching heat, but nights could bring bone-chilling cold. She arranged the largest rocks into a crude windbreak and spread her thin blanket over a bed of smaller stones that she had cleared of scorpions and other desert creatures. The first fat raindrops began to fall as she finished, accompanied by gusts of wind that whipped her hair across her face. The storm approached with frightening speed, transforming the distant purple mountains into ominous shadows behind sheets of rain. Eliza worked frantically, digging a small depression in the sandy soil to catch what rain she could while positioning her canteen to collect the precious drops running off the large rock above her shelter. Thunder cracked directly overhead as the storm engulfed her camp. Rain pelted down with surprising force, soaking through her clothing in seconds. Eliza huddled in her makeshift shelter, shivering as wind drove the rain sideways through her flimsy windbreak. The small depression she had dug quickly filled with muddy water, but she cupped her hands eagerly, drinking despite the grit and sand. Survival trumped delicacy. The storm's intensity doubled, then tripled. Lightning split the sky in jagged bursts, illuminating the landscape in harsh white flashes that burned themselves into Eliza's retinas. Between flashes, the darkness seemed absolute. In one brilliant illumination, she spotted a narrow crevice in the rock formation behind her shelter, a potential refuge from the storm's wrath. Gathering her soaked blanket and canteen, she scrambled toward the opening, feeling her way through the darkness between lightning strikes. The crevice was tight but deepened into a small hollow, just large enough for her to curl into. It smelled of dust and animal musk, but it was dry and sheltered from the wind that howled across the desert floor. Eliza pressed herself against the back of the hollow, wringing water from her hair and clothes as best she could. The temperature had dropped dramatically with the storm, and her wet clothing pulled heat from her body with alarming efficiency. She wrapped the damp blanket around her shoulders, knowing it offered little warmth, but needing the illusion of protection. Hours passed in a miserable blur of thunderclaps, shivering and desperate prayers. Each time Eliza began to drift into exhausted sleep, another crash of thunder would jolt her awake. Her mind filled with frontier stories about young women captured by Apache warriors, tales her uncle had relished telling with gruesome embellishments during the long winter evenings. "They take the pretty ones," he'd said with a malicious gleam in his eye. "Keep them as slaves until they're used up. The others they just kill on the spot." He'd looked at her with a calculating gaze. "Guess you'd be safe enough, plain as you—" A particularly violent thunderclap shook loose a shower of dirt from the hollow's ceiling, sprinkling Eliza's upturned face with gritty particles. She coughed and spat, adding this fresh misery to her growing list of torments. Her empty stomach had progressed from painful cramping to a strange, hollow absence of sensation that somehow felt worse. "I won't die here," she whispered fiercely. "To the darkness. I won't give him the satisfaction." The storm raged on, but eventually exhaustion overcame fear, discomfort, and hunger. Eliza fell into a fitful sleep filled with nightmares of pursuit, her uncle's wagon bearing down on her, Apache warriors circling on painted ponies, and strange shadowy creatures with gleaming eyes and sharp teeth. She woke with a start to eerie silence. The storm had passed, leaving behind a transformed world, bathed in pre-dawn light. The air felt cleansed and carried a rich scent of wet earth and desert plants. Water dripped from rock formations and collected in natural basins among the stones. The desert had briefly become an oasis. Eliza crawled from her refuge, muscles screaming in protest after hours cramped in the tiny space. Her clothes remained damp, but had lost their bone-chilling coldness. The eastern sky had begun to lighten with the first promise of sunrise, revealing the extent of the storm's gift. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. Puddles gleamed like scattered mirrors across the desert floor, reflecting the gradually brightening sky. She moved quickly to collect as much water as possible, filling her canteen from the cleanest puddles and drinking deeply from others. Who knew when such abundance would come again? The same question applied to food. With growing daylight, she searched for anything edible the storm might have revealed. Near the base of the rock formation, a small cluster of mushrooms had sprung up overnight. Eliza studied them carefully, comparing them to the descriptions her mother had drilled into her. Brown caps, white stems, growing in the shadow of rocks after rain. They matched the safe varieties she had been taught to recognize. Still, she hesitated before breaking off the smallest one and nibbling a tiny piece. The risk of poison was real, but so was the certainty of starvation if she found nothing to eat. When no ill effects followed her cautious taste, Eliza gathered the mushrooms into a small pile, rationing herself to just 2 of the larger specimens. The earthy flavor and chewy texture brought tears to her eyes, not for their culinary merit, but for the simple miracle of finding nourishment in this harsh land. As the sun breached the horizon, casting long shadows across the desert, Eliza faced the question she'd been avoiding since her uncle's wagon disappeared. What now? In every direction lay danger: Apache territory, harsh desert, or the threat of encountering her uncle again if she tried to return to the nearest settlement. The water she had collected might last 2 days, if carefully rationed. The mushrooms and remaining cactus fruit, perhaps 1 day of meager sustenance. A distant howl echoed across the landscape, coyotes signaling the end of their night hunt. Another danger to add to her growing list. Eliza climbed atop the largest rock to survey her surroundings in the growing light. From this vantage point, she could see a line of greener vegetation, perhaps 3 miles to the southwest, possibly indicating a seasonal creek or spring. Water meant life in the desert, not just for her, but for game animals she might trap or forage near. The decision made itself. Water was her only real hope. Eliza gathered her few possessions, filled her canteen with the clearest rainwater she could find, and began walking toward the distant green line. The rising sun quickly burned away the brief morning coolness, replacing it with the familiar oppressive heat. She set a deliberate pace, knowing that haste would only accelerate dehydration and exhaustion. Each step stirred conflicting emotions. Part of her still reeled from the shock of her abandonment, the casual cruelty with which her own blood had discarded her. Another part simmered with a rage so profound it felt like a physical presence in her chest. But beneath both emotions ran a current of determination that surprised her with its strength. Thomas Carter had left her to die, but she would not accommodate his plans. By mid-morning, the green line had resolved itself into distinct shapes, cottonwoods and willows, following the course of what must be a seasonal wash. The sight brought fresh energy to Eliza's tired legs. She paused in the shadow of a large rock to rest briefly and preserve her dwindling water supply, scanning the horizon with increasing vigilance. This close to water, the likelihood of encountering others, settlers, travelers, or Apache, increased dramatically. A flicker of movement on a distant ridge caught her attention. Eliza froze, pressing herself against the sun-warmed stone. A mounted figure silhouetted against the sky, motionless and watchful, her heart hammered against her ribs. Even at this distance, the distinctive outline was unmistakable. Not a settler's slouched posture or a cavalry soldier's rigid bearing, but the alert, integrated stance of an Apache warrior merged with his mount as if they were a single creature. Eliza remained perfectly still, barely breathing. Had he seen her? The figure remained motionless for what seemed an eternity before turning his horse and disappearing over the ridge. She released her breath in a shuddering exhale, but the momentary relief quickly gave way to new fear. If one Apache warrior patrolled these lands, others would surely be nearby. The water source now represented both salvation and terrible risk. Yet she had no choice but to continue. Without water, death was certain. With water, death was merely probable. Eliza chose the slender hope of survival, moving forward with renewed caution, using every rock and bush for cover. The sun climbed toward its zenith as she neared the edge of the wash. The sound of water, actual running water, not just damp soil, reached her ears, nearly bringing her to tears. The storm had transformed the normally dry creek bed into a flowing stream that gurgled over smooth stones and carved miniature canyons in the sandy bottom. Eliza approached the water's edge warily, every sense alert for danger. She knelt beside a small pool formed by a natural rock dam, gazing at her reflection for the first time in days. A stranger stared back, sunburned, dirt-streaked, with wild tangles of copper hair framing hollow cheeks and eyes too large for her thin face. Her uncle's voice echoed in her memory, plain as a mud fence and twice as useless. The cool water on her blistered lips and parched throat drove all other thoughts away. Eliza drank slowly, remembering her mother's warnings about drinking too. Quickly, after deprivation, between sips, she scanned her surroundings, the awareness of the Apache warrior's proximity keeping her vigilance sharp. A stand of cottonwoods downstream offered better shelter than the exposed creek bank. Eliza filled her canteen and moved carefully toward the trees, searching for a defensible position with good visibility. The sound of birds among the branches reassured her somewhat. They would fall silent at any human approach, providing natural warning. Beneath the largest cottonwood, she discovered evidence of previous visitors, a fire ring of carefully placed stones and several broken arrow shafts. Apache or travelers, the signs weren't fresh, but they confirmed her suspicions that this water source was known and used. She would need to remain constantly alert. Exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her as the day's heat reached its peak. Eliza arranged her blanket in the densest shade, creating a small shelter that offered some protection while allowing her to observe the surrounding terrain. She needed rest desperately, but feared the vulnerability of sleep in this dangerous place. As she huddled in her makeshift shelter, mind racing with plans and fears, a strange calm gradually settled over her. Whatever came next, survival, capture, or death, would not be of her uncle's choosing. For the first time since her parents' death, Eliza Carter controlled her own fate. The realization straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin. The afternoon heat soon became a physical weight, pressing Eliza toward unwanted sleep. Her eyelids grew impossibly heavy despite her determination to remain vigilant. Just a few minutes of rest, she promised herself, just enough to gather strength for the coming night. She positioned herself facing the open wash, her small knife clutched in her right hand, and allowed her eyes to close. She woke with a start, heart pounding, knowing instinctively that something had changed. The quality of light suggested several hours had passed, the harsh midday glare replaced by the golden hue of late afternoon. Birds had fallen silent. A prickling sensation crawled up her spine. Eliza wasn't alone. With excruciating slowness, she turned her head toward the creek bed. There, not 20 paces away, a man knelt by the water. Not her uncle or any settler she recognized. An Apache warrior, powerful and still, filling his waterskin from the flowing stream. His back was to her, but she had no doubt he knew exactly where she was hiding. Every frontier tale of Apache brutality flooded Eliza's mind, freezing her in place. The warrior wore buckskin leggings and a cotton shirt, with a knife sheathed at his waist and what appeared to be a rifle secured across his back. His long black hair was bound with a strip of red cloth, and his movements spoke of absolute confidence in his surroundings. As if sensing her waking gaze, he turned slowly toward her shelter. Dark eyes met hers across the distance, his expression unreadable. Neither moved for what seemed an eternity. When he finally stood, Eliza's grip tightened on her pathetic knife. If death came today, she would face it with what courage she could muster. The warrior's gaze never left her face as he took a single step in her direction. The Apache warrior took another measured step toward Eliza, his movements deliberate and unhurried. She pressed her back against the cottonwood trunk, knife raised, in trembling defense. If her uncle's stories held any truth, death would be a mercy compared to capture. "You are far from your people, sunburned one," the warrior spoke in accented but clear English, stopping at a respectful distance. The unexpected words startled Eliza more than any attack. She had not imagined her fate would include conversation. "I have no people," she replied, her voice cracking from disuse and dehydration. "Not anymore." Something flickered across the warrior's stoic features. Surprise, perhaps, or a flicker of interest. He studied her with penetrating intensity, taking in her disheveled appearance, the knife clutched in her white-knuckled grip, and the meager possessions scattered around her makeshift shelter. "The wagon man who left you," he said, gesturing toward the distant ridge. "He is not your father." The question triggered a fresh wave of bitter memory. "My uncle," Eliza clarified, knife still raised. "My parents died of fever. He was supposed to care for me." The warrior nodded as if confirming. "A private theory. I am called Nakohe," he offered unexpectedly. "It means warrior who walks alone in your tongue." The formal introduction confused Eliza's terror-addled mind. Brutal Apache raiders didn't introduce themselves to their victims, at least not in her uncle's lurid tales. Uncertainty crept in alongside her fear, leaving her speechless. "You have courage to face me with that toy," Nakohe commented, gesturing toward her small knife. "But little skill to survive these lands alone." Eliza bristled despite her fear. "I've managed well enough so far." A sound escaped Nakohe that might have been a suppressed laugh. "You have lived one day in territory where even experienced Apache move with caution." His gaze swept the horizon. "The coyotes would have found you by tomorrow's sunset." The blunt assessment stung because she recognized its truth. Even with water, her survival prospects were slim. Predators, exposure, starvation, or hostile encounters. Death wore many faces in this unforgiving land. "What will you do with me?" she finally asked, voicing the question that mattered most. Her knife remained raised, though they both knew its futility. Nakohe considered her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "That depends on what you would do with yourself, sunburned one." The cryptic answer held neither threat nor reassurance. Eliza's mind raced through limited options. Flee, impossible. Fight, suicidal. Beg for mercy, unbearable. "I wish to live," she said finally, the simple truth of it burning in her chest. Nakohe nodded once, as if her answer held significance beyond its obvious meaning. Without warning, he reached into a pouch at his waist. Eliza tensed, expecting a weapon, but he withdrew what appeared to be a strip of dried meat. "Eat," he said, extending it toward her. "The body weakens before the spirit." Hunger warred with suspicion as Eliza stared at the offered food. Could it be poisoned? Did it matter when starvation awaited regardless? Nakohe seemed to read her thoughts. With deliberate movements, he broke the strip in half, placing one portion in his own mouth and chewing before offering the remainder. The gesture transcended language, a universal reassurance. Eliza lowered her knife and accepted the jerky with her free hand. The dried meat was tough and salty, requiring careful chewing, but its rich flavor awakened her hunger with painful intensity. She fought the urge to devour it, forcing herself to eat slowly as her mother had taught her. "The wagon man?" Nakohe said as she ate. "Why did he leave you to die?" The directness of the question caught Eliza off guard. She swallowed a difficult mouthful before answering. "He never wanted me." After my parents died, he took me in because the settlement pastor insisted. Her voice hardened. He said I ate too much, worked too little, and would never find a husband to take me off his hands. So he gives you to the Apache lands instead. Nakohe observed, his tone neutral. He thinks the Apache will kill me, Eliza said, meeting his gaze directly. Or worse. And what do you think, sunburned one? The question hung between them, laden with implications. What did she think of the warrior standing before her, contradicting every terrifying story she'd been told about his people? I think. Eliza began carefully, that my uncle knows as little about Apache as he does about proper Christian charity. Something that might have been approval flickered in Nakohe's dark eyes. He glanced at the sinking sun, then back to Eliza. Night comes. Soon, he stated. Your shelter is poor. The night creatures will find you easily. Eliza followed his gaze to her pathetic arrangement of blanket and branches. He wasn't wrong. What do you suggest? She asked, surprising herself with the question. Hours ago, she would never have imagined seeking survival advice from an Apache. Warrior Nakohe studied the cottonwood grove, then the surrounding terrain. There is a place, not far. Better protection. He didn't elaborate, didn't insist, simply offered the information and waited. The choice, Eliza realized, was genuinely hers. He would not force her to accompany him, nor would he prevent her from remaining to face almost certain death. Why would you help me? She asked, the question that had burned in her mind since his unexpected conversation began. Nakohe's expression shifted subtly, a shadow crossing his features. I had a sister once. Yellow fever took her 2 winters past. She would be your age now. The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken grief. Eliza found herself believing him despite years of conditioned distrust. There was no artifice in his words, no elaborate deception, just a simple truth offered without expectation. I'll go with you, she decided, gathering her meager possessions with hands that trembled less than before. Nakohe nodded once, as if he'd expected no other answer. We leave now. Daylight fades quickly. As Eliza bundled her blanket and secured her canteen, she couldn't shake the surreal quality of the moment. Yesterday, she had been her uncle's unwanted burden. Today, she followed an Apache warrior into unknown territory. What would tomorrow bring? They traveled in silence along the creek bed for nearly a mile before Nakohe veered westward, leading them toward a line of low hills. The setting sun painted the landscape in vibrant oranges and purples, transforming the harsh terrain into something almost beautiful. Eliza struggled to keep pace with Nakohe's efficient stride, her city-bred legs unaccustomed to the rough ground, and her body weakened by hunger and exposure. He never hurried her, never expressed impatience at her slower pace, but neither did he offer unnecessary assistance. When they reached a particularly steep incline, he simply waited at the top, watching with analytical interest as she found her own path upward. You need better footwear, he observed when she finally joined him, glancing at her thin-soled boots cracked from the harsh terrain. Those are made for wooden floors, not mountain paths. Eliza couldn't argue with his assessment. Her feet throbbed with every step, blisters forming and breaking beneath the worn leather. I didn't exactly plan this excursion, she replied with unexpected sharpness. A ghost of a smile touched Nakohe's lips before vanishing. Few who die in these lands planned their journey. The blunt statement sobered Eliza instantly. He wasn't being cruel, merely stating a reality she needed to understand if she hoped to survive. They crested the hill as twilight deepened around them. Below stretched a shallow valley nestled between protective ridges, a small stream perhaps, a tributary of the creek they had followed, cut through its center. Near the water stood what appeared to be a crude shelter, not the teepees of her uncle's Apache stories, but a more permanent structure built against a rock outcropping. "What is this place?" Eliza asked, surveying the sheltered valley. Hunting. Camp, Nakohe replied. Used by my people when game is plentiful in these hills. He led her down the slope toward the shelter, which revealed itself to be more sophisticated than it had appeared from a distance. Built partially into the natural rock formation, its walls were constructed of stacked stone and timber, with a roof of branches and earth that would be nearly invisible from above. "No one else is here?" Eliza questioned, noting the absence of other Apache. "The hunting parties moved north this season," Nakohe explained, "following the elk herds to higher ground." "Then why are you here alone?" The question escaped before she could consider its potential rudeness. Nakohe paused at the shelter's entrance, his expression unreadable in the fading light. "I told you my name, warrior who walks alone. It is not just a name, but a path." He disappeared inside before she could respond, leaving Eliza to wonder at the layers of meaning in his simple statement. She hesitated only briefly before following him into the dimness of the shelter. The interior surprised her with its orderliness. A central fire pit occupied the middle of the single room, with sleeping platforms along one wall and various implements hanging from the rafters. Nakohe moved with practiced efficiency, striking a spark to a small pile of tinder and coaxing it into flame. As firelight filled the space, Eliza stood awkwardly near the entrance, uncertain of her place in this unfamiliar setting. The reality of her situation pressed in with renewed force, alone in an Apache hunting camp with a warrior she had known for mere hours. Yet strangely, fear had receded, replaced by a wary curiosity. "Sit," Nakohe instructed, gesturing toward a woven mat near the fire. "Rest your feet," Eliza obeyed, sinking gratefully onto the surprisingly comfortable surface. The fire's warmth reached toward her, chasing away the evening chill that had begun to settle over the desert. She watched as Nakohe moved about the shelter, retrieving items from leather pouches and wooden containers. He knelt beside a stone basin filled with water from a skin hanging near the entrance, mixing various dried plants and powders with methodical precision. The resulting paste emitted a sharp medicinal odor that filled the small space. "Remove your boots," he directed without looking up from his preparation. Eliza hesitated, equal parts embarrassment and lingering distrust, making her reluctant to reveal such vulnerability. Nakohe glanced up, reading her expression. "Your feet will fester without treatment. Infection in these lands means death." The stark assessment left little room for modesty. Eliza unlaced her boots, wincing as the leather pulled away from raw, blistered skin. Her woolen stockings were worn through in several places, revealing angry red sores that had begun to weep clear fluid. Nakohe made no comment on their condition. He simply placed the basin of water before her and gestured for her to immerse her feet. The cool water stung initially, then soothed as dirt and dried blood dissolved away. While Eliza soaked her feet, Nakohe busied himself preparing a simple meal: more dried meat, some kind of ground grain mixed with dried berries, and a tea brewed from aromatic leaves. The domestic normalcy of these activities stood in stark contrast to everything Eliza had been taught to expect from Apache warriors. "You speak excellent English," she observed, breaking the comfortable silence that had developed between them. Nakohe continued his preparations without looking up. "I spent 5 winters at the white man's school in Santa Fe before the war between states." The revelation startled Eliza. "You were educated at a mission school." "Educated," he repeated, a bitter edge entering his voice for the first time. "Yes, they called it that. They took our language, cut our hair, dressed us in scratchy uniforms, and beat us when we spoke our mother tongue." He looked up then, his dark eyes reflecting firelight. "But I learned your words, your numbers, your writing. I learned how white men think, what they value, what they fear." A grim smile touched his lips. That knowledge serves me better than any bow or rifle. Eliza absorbed this, connecting it to fragmented conversations she had overheard between her father and traveling missionaries years ago. Discussions about civilizing the savages through education and Christianity. "Did you choose to go there?" she asked. "My father was killed by cavalry soldiers," Nakohe replied matter-of-factly. "My mother thought the school would protect me from the same fate." He stirred the simmering tea. She was wrong in ways she could not have imagined. The simple statement carried such weight that Eliza found herself momentarily speechless. What response could possibly acknowledge the depth of such experiences? "I'm sorry," she offered finally, the words inadequate but sincere. Nakohe looked up, genuine surprise crossing his features. "You have lost more than I, sunburned one, and more recently. Yet you offer sympathy to me?" Eliza shrugged, uncomfortable with his scrutiny. "Loss is loss. Pain is pain. Does it matter whose is greater?" Nakohe studied her with renewed interest, as if seeing beyond her sunburned skin and tangled hair to something unexpected beneath. "Remove your feet now," he instructed, setting aside the tea. "The medicine will sting, but heal." As Eliza withdrew her feet from the basin, Nakohe knelt before her with the paste he had prepared. His hands were surprisingly gentle as he applied the mixture to her blistered skin, his touch clinical rather than intimate. The substance burned initially, drawing a sharp intake of breath from Eliza, but the sensation quickly transformed into blessed numbness. "What is it made from?" she asked, watching as he wrapped her feet in strips of soft buckskin. "Pine resin, juniper sage, and plants your people have no names for," he replied. "Apache medicine passed through generations." When he had finished, Nakohe moved away to continue meal preparations, leaving Eliza to marvel at the immediate relief his treatment had provided. Her feet, which had screamed with every step just hours before, now felt merely tender rather than agonizing. As they shared the simple meal in companionable silence, Eliza found herself studying her unlikely rescuer. Nakohe's features were sharp and weathered, suggesting a man in his late 20s who had lived a life of hardship and outdoor exposure. Yet there was an intelligence in his eyes that spoke of more than practical survival knowledge, a thoughtfulness she had rarely encountered on the frontier. "Why do you walk alone?" she asked suddenly, remembering his earlier cryptic statement. Nakohe paused with a piece of meat halfway to his mouth, considering her question with the seriousness it deserved. "The world changes," he said finally. "My people stand at a crossroads. Some choose resistance, fighting until the last warrior falls. Others choose the reservation, safety in surrender." His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I choose a different path." "What path?" Eliza pressed, genuinely curious. "Understanding," he replied simply. "I walk between worlds, learning both, belonging to neither." He set down his food, meeting her gaze directly. "The future belongs not to those who fight hardest or surrender quickest, but to those who understand most deeply." The philosophy surprised Eliza with its sophistication. Her uncle and his frontier companions spoke of Apache as simple-minded savages, driven by bloodlust and superstition. Nakohe's worldview contradicted those prejudices entirely. "You sound more like my father than—" She trailed off, embarrassed by her near comparison to savages. "Than an Apache," Nakohe finished for her, no judgment in his tone. "Your father, what manner of man was he?" The question awakened memories Eliza had carefully preserved through years of her uncle's determined efforts to erase them. "He was a school teacher," she explained, warmth entering her voice, "but also a naturalist who studied plants and animals. We came west because he believed education was needed in frontier settlements." She smiled faintly. "He said knowledge was the only true path to civilization, not guns or fences or even laws. Nakohe nodded thoughtfully. A wise man, the kind white settlements need more of. Uncle Thomas said his ideas got him and my mother killed, Eliza admitted, the familiar pain resurfacing. Said no sensible man brings women to untamed territory for something as useless as books. And what do you believe? Nakohe asked. The question gentle but probing. Eliza considered this, realizing no one had asked for her opinion on anything of consequence since her parents' death. I believe they died of fever, not ideas, she said finally, and that my father would rather have. Died bringing knowledge to others than lived withholding it. Nakohe's expression softened almost imperceptibly. Then his spirit lives in you, Eliza Carter. Remember that when paths grow difficult. The use of her full name startled her. How did you— Your uncle shouted it when he pushed you from the wagon, Nakohe explained. I was watching from the ridge. The revelation that he had witnessed her abandonment from the beginning brought a flush of shame to Eliza's cheeks. Had he seen her tears, her weakness, her complete helplessness? If you saw everything, she asked, a new thought occurring. Why didn't you help me sooner? Nakohe regarded her steadily across the fire. Would you have accepted help from an Apache warrior in that moment? Or would terror have added to your suffering? The question needed no answer. They both knew the truth. Rest now, Nakohe said, rising to his feet with fluid grace. Tomorrow brings decisions that require strength. Eliza wanted to ask what decisions he meant, but exhaustion suddenly overwhelmed her, the day's events crashing down with physical force. Nakohe pointed her toward one of the sleeping platforms, where furs and woven blankets offered more comfort than she had known since leaving her parents' home. As she settled onto the surprisingly soft surface, a final question pressed for voice. Nakohe, she said softly, am I your prisoner? He paused in banking the fire for the night, looking up with an expression that might have been surprise or amusement. No, Eliza Carter, he replied. You are not my prisoner, nor are you yet free. What does that mean? It means sleep now, he said, returning to his task. Understanding will come with the sunrise. As darkness claimed the shelter and Eliza drifted toward much-needed sleep, she realized that for the first time since her abandonment, fear no longer dominated her thoughts. In its place grew something fragile but persistent. Not quite trust, but perhaps its precursor. Whatever tomorrow brought, she would face it with greater strength than she had possessed today. That much, at least, Nakohe had already given her. Dawn broke with golden fingers stretching across the valley, illuminating the hunting camp in warm light. Eliza woke to the unfamiliar yet comforting sense of pine smoke and brewing tea. For a disorienting moment, she imagined herself back in her parents' home, her mother preparing breakfast while her father reviewed his lesson plans at the table. Reality reasserted itself as she opened her eyes to the stone walls of the Apache hunting camp. Her feet, wrapped in Nakohe's medicinal bindings, throbbed dully but with significantly less pain than the previous evening. The warrior himself knelt by the rekindled fire, his back to her as he tended a small cooking pot. The sunburned one. Wakes, he observed without turning. Your sleep was deep but troubled. Eliza sat up, wondering how he had sensed her wakefulness. I dreamed of my parents, she admitted, swinging her legs gingerly over the edge of the sleeping platform, and of my uncle. Nakohe turned then, offering a carved wooden cup filled with steaming liquid. Dreams speak truths we hide from ourselves in daylight, he said. What truth did yours reveal? The question was unexpected, but somehow not intrusive. Eliza accepted the cup, inhaling the unfamiliar but pleasant aroma before answering. That I've been mourning more than my parents, she said slowly, realizing the truth as she spoke it. I've been mourning the person I might have become if they had lived. Nakohe nodded, as if her answer confirmed something he already suspected. The path not walked haunts many hearts. The tea tasted of sage and something sweeter, honey perhaps, or a wild equivalent. Its warmth spread through Eliza's body, chasing away the night's chill and bringing renewed clarity to her thoughts. "You said yesterday that decisions await," she prompted, watching Nakohe return to his cooking. "Yes," he confirmed, stirring. What appeared to be a porridge of ground seeds and dried fruits. "3 paths lie before you, each with its own dangers." He served a portion of the porridge into a shallow wooden bowl and handed it to Eliza before continuing. "The first path leads eastward, back toward white settlements. I could guide you to within sight of Cottonwood Springs, 3 days' journey. There you might find passage to a larger town, perhaps work as a domestic servant." Eliza considered this option, spooning the surprisingly flavorful porridge into her mouth. Return to a settlement, not her uncle's, but one where no one knew. Her story. Start again as a servant girl, working for shelter and meager wages. It was a common enough fate for orphaned girls on the frontier. Not promising, but familiar. "The second path," Nakohe continued, settling across from her with his own portion, "leads westward to Fort Sagebrush. 6 days of difficult travel. But there you would find the Indian Agency. They maintain a school for orphaned white children and converted natives." This option surprised Eliza. She knew of the Indian agencies that administered the government's policies toward native tribes, but had never considered them as potential havens for someone in her situation. "They would take in a girl my age?" she asked skeptically. "Until 17 summers," Nakohe confirmed. "Then you would be expected to marry or take employment as a teacher's assistant." His expression revealed nothing of his personal opinion. "About this path. And the third option?" Eliza prompted, setting aside her empty bowl. Nakohe studied her carefully before answering. "The third path follows no established trail. It leads to those like myself who walk between worlds. A small settlement in the high valleys where Apache, Navajo, Mexican, and yes, a few whites live apart from both reservation and frontier town." This third option caught Eliza completely by surprise. She had never heard of such a place. A settlement of outcasts from multiple cultures coexisting beyond the reach of governments or tribal councils. "How is that possible?" she asked. "The army patrols everywhere, hunting for Apache who refuse the reservation." "They patrol where they expect to find us," Nakohe corrected. "Not where they believe no man can survive." He rose, collecting their empty bowls and moving toward the doorway. "Come, your feet need unwrapping, and you should see the valley in morning light before choosing your path." Outside, the hunting camp revealed its strategic positioning. Nestled in a natural bowl surrounded by low ridges, it remained invisible until one practically stumbled upon it. The small stream gurgled cheerfully through the center of the valley, sustaining a strip of greenery that contrasted beautifully with the red-orange landscape beyond. Nakohe led Eliza to a flat rock beside the water, gesturing for her to sit and extend her feet. With the same careful attention he had shown the previous evening, he unwrapped the buckskin bindings, revealing significant improvement in her blistered skin. The angry redness had faded, and the open sores had begun to form protective scabs. "The medicine works quickly," Eliza observed with relief. "Apache healing knowledge goes back countless generations," Nakohe replied, immersing her feet in the cool stream water to rinse away the remaining paste. "Before white man's glass beads existed, before his metal knives, before his horses, we knew how to heal wounds and set bones." He applied a fresh coating of the medicinal paste, then wrapped her feet in clean buckskin strips cut from what appeared to be a small deerskin. "These will protect better than your boots," he explained, fashioning simple moccasins that laced around her ankles. "The soft hide bends with your feet instead of forcing them into unnatural shapes." Eliza flexed her feet experimentally, marveling at the comfortable fit and unexpected softness of the makeshift footwear. "Thank you," she said, the words inadequate for the care she had received. "For everything?" Nakohe's expression remained impassive, but something in his eyes softened momentarily. "Thanks are unnecessary between travelers who share a difficult road." He stood, surveying the surrounding ridgelines with practiced vigilance. "You must choose your path soon. It is not safe to remain in one place long." "Why?" Eliza asked suddenly, alert to a tension in his posture that hadn't been present before. "Are we in danger here?" Nakohe's gaze continued sweeping the horizon. "Your uncle's wagon left clear tracks. If others from his settlement grow curious about your disappearance, they may follow those tracks. The possibility hadn't occurred to me." "Eliza, why would they? He'll tell them I ran away or was taken by Apache raiders. No one would risk themselves to verify his story." "Perhaps," Nakohe conceded, "but there are others who read sign and follow tracks for reasons of their own. Army scouts, bounty hunters, men who profit from conflict between Apache and settler." A chill ran through Eliza despite the warming day. Her uncle's abandonment had created ripples that might reach far beyond his intentions. "How long do we have?" "To decide?" she asked. "Until midday," Nakohe replied. "Then we must move regardless of direction." He left her by the stream to consider her options, disappearing into the hunting camp to prepare for their departure. Eliza watched the water flow past her feet, carrying tiny minnows and water insects on its endless journey. Each option Nakohe had presented carried its own uncertainty and risk. Return to white settlements. She would escape her uncle, but face the harsh reality of a young woman alone on the frontier, subject to the charity or exploitation of strangers. The Indian agency? Perhaps education and temporary security, but at what cost to her independence? And what prejudices might she face as a white orphan among native children, the mysterious settlement of outcasts? An unknown quantity entirely, potentially offering the greatest freedom, but also the greatest danger. As she weighed these options, movement on the eastern ridge caught her attention. Squinting against the morning sun, Eliza discerned a mounted figure silhouetted against the sky, too distant to identify, but clearly watching the valley. Her heart raced as she scrambled to her feet, the new moccasins gripping the uneven ground. With surprising security, she hurried back to the hunting camp, finding Nakohe already alert and watching the same ridge. "Rider!" she said unnecessarily, pointing toward the distant figure. Nakohe nodded grimly. "Not Apache. No Apache would silhouette himself against the sky so carelessly." "My uncle?" Eliza suggested, fear tightening her chest. "Impossible to determine. At this distance," Nakohe replied, "but we must assume danger until proven otherwise." He turned toward the shelter, gesturing for her to follow. "Help me gather only what we need. We leave immediately." Inside, Nakohe moved with efficient purpose, selecting items with careful deliberation: a water skin, dried provisions, a small knife which he handed to Eliza, a larger one he secured at his waist, and a well-maintained Winchester rifle that had been concealed beneath one of the sleeping platforms. "I thought Apache preferred bows," Eliza remarked. Accepting a small leather pouch he indicated she should fill with the dried food. "I prefer what keeps me alive," Nakohe replied without humor. "The bow is silent, but limited. The rifle speaks loudly but reaches farther." Within minutes, they had assembled small packs containing only the essentials. Nakohe extinguished the fire with practiced movements that left no smoke to betray their presence, then led Eliza to a narrow passage at the western end of the valley, due opposite from where the rider had been spotted. "We go west for now," he explained, scanning the ridgeline one final time. "Not committing to any path yet, but creating distance from whoever watches." The passage proved to be the entrance to a dry wash that wound through increasingly rugged terrain. Nakohe set a demanding pace, not running but moving with the ground-eating stride of someone accustomed to covering vast distances on foot. Eliza struggled to match his rhythm, her newly bandaged feet adjusting to the soft moccasins and uneven ground. "Who do you think it is?" she asked when they paused briefly in the shadow of a towering rock formation, the valley left far behind. "Many possibilities," Nakohe replied, offering her the water skin. "None good." He studied their back trail with narrowed eyes. "Settler posse looking for Apache to blame for your disappearance. Army scout following rumors of renegades. Bounty hunter seeking reward for captured Apache. Or my uncle," Eliza added quietly, "perhaps regretting his decision to abandon me so publicly." Nakohe's expression darkened. "If he returns, it is not from regret but fear of consequences. A man who discards family like worn-out moccasins has no heart for regret." They continued westward through increasingly broken country, following game trails and ancient paths known only to those who had inhabited these lands for generations. By midday, they had climbed significantly higher, the desert landscape giving way to scattered juniper and pinon pine that offered welcome shade from the relentless sun. Nakohe chose a vantage point overlooking their back trail for their brief rest. He shared strips of dried venison and what appeared to be cakes made from ground acorn meal, watching the terrain below with unwavering vigilance. "I see nothing following," Eliza observed, her eyes scanning the maze of washes and ravines. "They had traversed. That means little," Nakohe replied. "A skilled tracker stays hidden, using terrain to conceal his approach." "Are you expecting someone specific?" Eliza asked, sensing tension beneath his usual stoic demeanor. Nakohe was silent for a long moment before responding. "There is a man, half Mexican, half Navajo, who tracks for the army at Fort Sagebrush. They call him El Cuervo, the Raven." His voice took on a harder edge. "He has led soldiers to 3 Apache camps in the past year. Women and children died because of his tracking skills." "And you think he might be following us?" Eliza asked, a new fear blooming in her chest. "If your uncle reached a settlement and reported Apache raiders, the army would send their best tracker." Nakohe's hand moved unconsciously to his rifle. "El Cuervo enjoys his work too much." The personal nature of this enmity was clear, though Nakohe offered no further explanation. Eliza wondered what history existed between the Apache warrior and this mixed-blood tracker, but knew better than to press for details. They resumed their journey after the brief rest, now following a game trail that climbed steadily toward a high saddle between twin peaks. The vegetation thickened as they ascended, providing better concealment but also more opportunities for ambush. Nakohe moved with increased caution, frequently pausing to listen and study their surroundings. "The settlement you mentioned," Eliza ventured during one such pause, "the one with people from different tribes and backgrounds. How far is it?" 4 days, if we travel directly," Nakohe replied, his gaze sweeping the ridge above them. "Longer if we must move cautiously or take indirect routes. And it's safe there. From the army and bounty hunters," a grim smile touched Nakohe's lips. "No place is truly safe in these times. But it is safer than most. Few know of its existence, and those who do guard the secret carefully." He resumed, walking, leading them up a particularly steep section that required using hands as well as feet. "The valley is difficult to find and more difficult to attack. Natural defense is better than any fort walls." "How did such a place come to exist?" Eliza asked, genuinely curious about this anomaly in the violent frontier narrative she had always been taught. "After the Great War between states," Nakohe explained, pausing to help her over a challenging section, "a white officer who had fought for the North came west. He had married a Cherokee woman in the Eastern Territories and seen how his own government treated her people despite their attempts to adopt white ways. They reached a small plateau that offered momentary respite from the climb. This officer, Captain Wheeler, believed that peaceful coexistence was possible, but not under reservation system or frontier justice. He found a hidden valley where trade had occurred between tribes for generations. With his military knowledge and his wife's diplomatic skills, they created a sanctuary for those who sought a different path. The story sounded almost mythical, to Eliza's ears, too hopeful for the brutal reality of territorial expansion she had witnessed. "And the army allows this?" she asked skeptically. "They do not allow what they cannot find," Nakohe replied. "Captain Wheeler chose well. The valley appears on no maps, and those who live there maintain careful watch on approaches." He gestured toward the high saddle still some distance above them. Beyond that pass lies the beginning of Wheeler's territory. Not the valley itself, but the outer boundaries his people patrol. The possibility of such a sanctuary, improbable as it seemed, awakened something in Eliza that had lain dormant since her parents' death. Hope. Not the desperate hope of mere survival, but something more profound, hope for a life with meaning beyond mere existence. Before she could voice these thoughts, Nakohe suddenly tensed, dropping into a crouch and pulling Eliza down beside him. "What?" she began, but his hand covered her mouth, silencing the question. He pointed toward a rocky outcropping some distance below and to their right. At first, Eliza saw nothing. Then a slight movement caught her eye. A figure in dust-colored clothing moving with practiced stealth from one position of cover to another, not a random settler or casual traveler. Someone tracking them with professional skill. Nakohe's lips moved close to her ear. "Stay here. Do not move regardless of what happens." He pressed the small knife into her hand. "If I do not return by sunset, follow the game trail through the saddle. Keep the twin peaks behind you until you reach a stream with 3 large boulders. Wait there." Fear clutched at Eliza's heart. "Where are you going?" "To ensure our trail ends here," he replied grimly, checking his rifle before slipping away with such fluid silence that even watching directly, Eliza could barely track his movement. Alone. In the unfamiliar wilderness, Eliza pressed herself against the rocky ground, making her body as small and inconspicuous as possible. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, as she watched the terrain below, straining to catch any movement or sound that might indicate what was happening. The crack of a rifle shot shattered the afternoon stillness, its report echoing off the surrounding rocks and making it impossible to determine its source or target. Birds erupted from nearby trees, their panicked flight marking the only movement in the otherwise frozen landscape. Eliza's heart pounded so violently she feared it might betray her position. Had Nakohe fired, or had he been the target? The uncertainty was almost worse than knowing. A second shot followed, then a third in rapid succession. Different firearms, Eliza realized, remembering her father's explanations of the distinct sounds made by various weapons. At least 2 people exchanging fire. Silence fell again, heavier than before. Eliza counted her heartbeats, reaching 300 before the faintest scuff of leather on stone alerted her to someone's approach. She gripped the knife Nakohe had given her, knuckles white with tension. "It is safe to rise now, Eliza Carter." Nakohe's voice sent a wave of relief through her, so powerful she nearly cried out. She pushed herself up to see him standing a few paces away, rifle in hand, and a fresh cut across his left cheek. "You're hurt," she said, moving toward him with instinctive concern. "Rock splinter from a near miss," he dismissed, wiping away the thin trickle of blood. "Nothing serious." What happened? Who was following us? Nakohe's expression hardened. Bounty hunters, 2 men working together. He secured his rifle across his back. "They will not follow further. The flat statement raised questions Eliza wasn't certain she wanted answered. "Did you—" "One will recover from his wounds," Nakohe replied, understanding her unspoken question. "The other will not. He had killed a man, perhaps a man hunting them specifically because of her disappearance." The reality of frontier violence, so often discussed in abstract terms back in settlement cabins, now stood before her in concrete form. Nakohe had taken a life to protect their path forward. "They were sent to find me?" she asked, needing to understand her role in this bloodshed. "No," Nakohe's reply held certainty. "They carried army papers offering payment for Apache captives, dead or alive. They saw our tracks and hoped for easy money." His expression darkened. "They were professionals, not settlement men. Your uncle's involvement is still unknown." The distinction provided little comfort. Men had tracked them, shots had been fired, and blood had been spilled, whether connected to her abandonment or simply the ongoing violence between settlers and Apache. They were now enmeshed in the brutal reality of territorial conflict. "We must move quickly now," Nakohe continued. "Already, gathering their small packs. Gunfire carries far in these canyons. Others may investigate." They abandoned the plateau, climbing with renewed urgency toward the high saddle Nakohe had indicated earlier. The terrain grew increasingly challenging. Loose rock giving way beneath their feet, thorny vegetation tearing at clothing and skin, the air thinning noticeably as they ascended. Eliza's newly healed feet began to throb again, but she pressed forward without complaint. The alternative, being captured by more bounty hunters or army patrols, provided powerful motivation to ignore physical discomfort. "What happens when we reach Wheeler's territory?" she asked when they paused briefly to catch their breath. "Will they welcome us or treat us with suspicion?" "Depends on who finds us first," Nakohe replied. "Some patrol riders know me and would offer immediate sanctuary. Others might be cautious, especially seeing you with an Apache warrior." "Because they'll think you've captured me," Eliza realized. "Like the stories settlers tell about Apache taking white women." Nakohe nodded grimly. "Stories told so often they become belief, even among those who should know better." The implications were clear. Even in Wheeler's supposedly enlightened community, prejudices and assumptions might threaten their reception. The simple fact of the partnership, Apache warrior and white girl traveling together, violated too many frontier taboos to be easily accepted. "What should I do if we're challenged?" Eliza asked, determined to be prepared. "Speak truth," Nakohe advised. "Nothing more powerful against assumption and prejudice." They reached the saddle as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, casting long shadows across the rugged landscape. From this elevation, Eliza could see for miles in all directions. The desert they had traversed to the east and to the west, a series of forested valleys descending toward distant mountains. Nakohe stood motionless beside her, surveying the terrain with focused intensity. After several minutes of silence, he pointed toward a thin column of smoke rising from a valley perhaps 2 miles distant. "Wheeler's outer sentry post," he explained. "They maintain small stations at each approach to their territory." "Will they have seen us already?" Eliza asked, noting how exposed they were on the saddle's crest. "Yes," Nakohe confirmed. "Watch all high passes. Riders are likely already approaching, though we cannot see them yet." As if summoned by his words, movement caught Eliza's eye. 3 mounted figures emerging from the tree line below, ascending toward their position with purposeful speed. Even at this distance, she could see they were heavily armed. "Friends of yours?" she asked, unable to keep the apprehension from her voice. "We will know soon enough," Nakohe replied, making no move to either flee or approach the riders. "Remember, speak truth, show no fear." As the riders drew closer, Eliza could distinguish their features and clothing. One appeared to be native, American, though not Apache from his distinctive headband and jewelry. Another was clearly Mexican or perhaps Spanish from his swarthy complexion and distinctive wide-brimmed hat. The third, surprisingly, was a woman, fair-skinned with dark hair pulled back severely, wearing men's clothing and riding astride like her companions. They halted their horses some 50 paces from where Eliza and Nakohe stood, rifles ready but not aimed directly at them. The Mexican rider nudged his horse forward slightly. "Bastante lejos de casa, no, Apache?" he called out in Spanish. "Far enough to seek better company, Miguel," Nakohe replied in English, a hint of familiarity in his tone. The rider laughed, some of the tension visibly easing from his posture. "Nakohe, you mad coyote, we heard shots and feared the worst." "The worst happened to those who followed us," Nakohe responded, his stance relaxing slightly, though not completely. The female rider moved her horse forward, keen eyes assessing Eliza with undisguised curiosity. "And who is this you bring to our doorstep, Nakohe?" Another stray for Wheeler's collection of outcasts. Before Nakohe could answer, Eliza stepped forward, chin raised despite her apprehension. "My name is Eliza Carter," she stated clearly. "My uncle abandoned me to die in Apache territory. Nakohe found me and has protected me. I seek shelter, and in return, I offer whatever skills I possess." The directness of her introduction appeared to surprise the patrol riders. The woman's eyes narrowed thoughtfully, while the Native American rider, still silent, exchanged a meaningful glance with Nakohe. "Bold words from one so young," the woman observed, her accent suggesting Eastern education despite her frontier appearance. "I am Sarah Wheeler. The decision to welcome you ultimately rests with my father. But first—" She was interrupted by the distant sound of multiple riders approaching from the east, from the direction Eliza and Nakohe had come. All heads turned toward the sound, tension instantly returning to the gathering. "Company," the man called Miguel muttered, raising his rifle slightly, "and not the friendly kind." "Bounty hunters had partners," Nakohe said grimly. "Or the army. Received word of shots fired." Sarah Wheeler made a swift decision. "No time for proper introductions. If you're being pursued, we can't leave you exposed here." She gestured sharply westward. "Follow us to the sentry post. We'll sort truths from lies once you're off this ridgeline." As they began moving quickly down the western slope, Eliza felt the weight of uncertainty lift slightly. They hadn't been welcomed with open arms, but neither had they been rejected. For a girl abandoned to die just days earlier, this qualified as significant progress, yet the approaching riders suggested their journey's dangers were far from over. Whatever sanctuary Wheeler's community might offer, they would have to reach it first. The descent into Wheeler's territory became a desperate race against the approaching riders. Sarah Wheeler led their small party down a barely visible trail that switchbacked steeply through pine and juniper, while Miguel and the silent Native American rider took rear positions, watching for pursuit. "The sentry post has defensible positions," Sarah explained tersely as they navigated a particularly treacherous section, "and reinforcements can arrive quickly if needed." Eliza struggled to keep pace, her newly healed feet protesting the rough terrain despite Nakohe's moccasins. The Apache warrior moved beside her, occasionally steadying her with a firm hand when loose stones threatened her balance. "Who follows us?" she asked, between labored breaths. "Army patrol, most likely," Sarah replied without slowing. The shots Nakohe exchanged with those bounty hunters would have drawn attention. Captain Reynolds at Fort Sagebrush has been looking for excuses to push into our territory for months. The implication was clear. Eliza and Nakohe had inadvertently brought trouble to Wheeler's doorstep. The knowledge added weight to Eliza's already burdened conscience. They reached a small clearing where a crude log structure nestled against a cliff face, nearly invisible among the surrounding trees. Smoke from its stone chimney had been what They spotted from the saddle. Two men emerged at their approach, one older with a magnificent grey beard, the other younger with the unmistakable features of mixed white and native heritage. "Riders coming down the east slope," Sarah reported briskly. "At least 5, possibly military." The older man nodded grimly. "James is already watching them through the glass," he confirmed, gesturing toward a concealed position higher on the cliff. "Blue coats for certain, Lieutenant Davis and his scout." At the mention of the scout, Nakohe's posture changed subtly, tension rippling through his frame. "El Cuervo?" he asked, his voice deceptively calm. The bearded man nodded. "Dismounted, and reading sign at the saddle right now." Nakohe's hand moved instinctively to his rifle. "Then we have little time. He will find our trail quickly." "Inside, both of you," Sarah ordered, dismounting in a fluid motion. "Father needs to know what's happening before we decide our course." The interior of the sentry post was surprisingly well appointed, a main room with a stone fireplace, rough-hewn furniture, and what appeared to be carefully drawn maps covering one wall. A short hallway suggested additional rooms beyond. A man rose from his seat beside the fire as they entered, tall, broad-shouldered, with the unmistakable bearing of military training despite his frontier clothing and long grey-streaked hair. One sleeve of his buckskin shirt hung empty, pinned at the shoulder. "Nakohe," he greeted with evident recognition. "Circumstances bring you back sooner than expected." "Trouble follows, Captain Wheeler," Nakohe replied respectfully. The man's weathered face revealed no surprise at this news. His attention shifted to Eliza, keen blue eyes, assessing her with penetrating intelligence. "And who might you be, young lady?" Before Eliza could answer, the door burst open, and the younger man who had been watching the eastern slope entered hurriedly. "They're coming direct, Captain. 6 riders. Lieutenant Davis, the Navajo scout, and 4 troopers. They've picked up the trail and are following it straight down." Wheeler absorbed this information with calm efficiency. "How long?" 20 minutes. Maybe less if they push their horses." Wheeler turned to his daughter. "Sarah, take our guests to the back room. Miguel, prepare the usual hospitality for the lieutenant." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "I believe the good army officer still has a fondness for your mothers." Recipe of corn whiskey. The strategy became clear to Eliza. Delay and misdirection rather than direct confrontation. These people had clearly dealt with military patrols before. Sarah led them down the short hallway to a small room containing supplies and additional weapons. A trapdoor in the floor revealed a root cellar beneath. "Down there," she instructed. "It connects to a passage leading further into the cliff if retreat becomes necessary." Nakohe hesitated, pride warring with practicality. "I do not hide from El Cuervo," he stated flatly. "This isn't about your personal feud," Sarah countered sharply. "If Davis finds you here, it gives him the excuse he needs to push into the valley itself. My father has maintained our independence through careful diplomacy, not needless confrontation." The logic was sound, but Eliza sensed deeper currents beneath Nakohe's resistance. Something personal existed between him and the army's scout, something beyond the general conflict between Apache and military forces. "I'll go down first," Eliza offered, breaking the tense standoff. "These soldiers are probably looking for me anyway, since my uncle likely reported me kidnapped by Apache." This practical reminder of her involvement in their predicament seemed to refocus Nakohe. With a curt nod, he helped Eliza descend the rough ladder into the earthen cellar below. He followed reluctantly, his movements betraying his discomfort. With enclosed spaces. Sarah closed the trapdoor above them, leaving them in near darkness, save for thin slices of light penetrating through floor cracks. The cellar smelled of earth, root vegetables, and the sharp tang of gunpowder, suggesting it served multiple purposes for Wheeler's community. "Who is El Cuervo?" Eliza whispered, the question that had burned in her mind since she first noticed Nakohe's reaction to the name. Why does he matter so much to you? In the dim light, Nakohe's features hardened into sharp angles and deep shadows. For a moment, Eliza thought he would refuse to answer, retreating behind his customary stoicism. Then, surprisingly, he spoke. Joaquin Vega, half Navajo, half Mexican. Once he was called brother by many Apache. His voice dropped to a near whisper, including me. The revelation stunned Eliza. He was your friend. More than friend. Blood brother. We attended the white man's school together in Santa Fe. Nakohe's hands clenched involuntarily. We made a pact to use what we learned there to help our people navigate the changing world. From above came the muffled sounds of horses arriving, men's voices calling greetings, boots on wooden floors. What happened? Eliza asked softly, sensing the importance of this history to their current predicament. The war between states ended. The army's attention turned fully west again. Nakohe's face was a mask of controlled emotion. Joaquin believed. Survival meant cooperation with the whites at any cost. I believed it meant maintaining our freedom and traditions, even if it required resistance. He fell silent as voices above grew louder, the unmistakable authoritative tones of a military officer, Wheeler's rumbling bass in response, the clink of glasses suggesting the promised whiskey had appeared. He betrayed you, Eliza guessed, filling the silence between them. He betrayed everyone who trusted him, Nakohe corrected. Became the army's eyes, leading them to hidden camps, to sacred places, to families who only wished to live free of the reservation's disease and hunger. The personal cost behind these words was evident. This wasn't merely political disagreement. It was intimate betrayal that had left scars deeper than any physical wound. My sister, Nakohe continued, his voice barely audible. The one I told you yellow fever claimed. That was the story I accepted to preserve my sanity. The truth is, she died from a soldier's bullet during a raid Joaquin led to our family's camp. Understanding crashed over Eliza like a physical blow. Nakohe's initial interest in her, his willingness to help an abandoned girl, suddenly took on new dimensions. His sister's ghost walked between them. Before she could respond to this devastating revelation, the trapdoor above creaked open. Sarah's face appeared in the opening, her expression tense but controlled. You need to come up, she said without preamble. Both of you. The soldiers, Eliza asked, fear tightening her chest. Still here, but circumstances have changed. My father believes. Honesty is now our best strategy. Nakohe's hand moved to his knife. El Cuervo knows I am here. Sarah nodded grimly. He found sign on the trail that he says could only be yours. And worse, the lieutenant has a witness with him. Someone who claims the girl was kidnapped by an Apache raider. Eliza's blood ran cold. My uncle. No, Sarah replied, her gaze shifting to Eliza. A man named Thomas Carter says he's your father. The world seemed to tilt beneath Eliza's feet, her uncle claiming to be her father, claiming she had been kidnapped rather than abandoned. The audacity of the lie staggered her. He is not my father, she managed, voice shaking with sudden rage. My father was Samuel Carter. He died of fever 3 years ago along with my mother. Thomas is my uncle who abandoned me to die in the desert. Sarah's expression softened slightly. That's what we suspected. Father thought it best you confront this man directly. Let the lieutenant hear the truth from your own lips. They climbed from the cellar into a scene of tense confrontation. In the main room, Captain Wheeler stood facing Lieutenant Davis, a young officer with a meticulously trimmed mustache, and the rigid posture of a man compensating for inexperience with excessive formality. Beside him stood a tall, lean man with the distinctive features of mixed Navajo and Mexican heritage, El Cuervo, unmistakable from Nakohe's description, and there, seated at the rough wooden table with a glass of whiskey clutched in his shaking hand, was Thomas Carter, Her uncle's bloodshot eyes widened in shock as Eliza entered the room. "Eliza! Thank God!" he exclaimed with a theatrical display of relief that turned her stomach. "These good soldiers have been helping me search for you since that savage took you from our wagon." The brazen lie ignited something in Eliza that transcended fear or uncertainty. This man had discarded her like unwanted baggage, leaving her to die alone in hostile territory. Now he sought to use her as a pawn in some new scheme, likely involving reward money for rescued settlers or compensation for damages suffered. She stepped forward, shoulders straight, chin raised, no longer the frightened girl who had huddled in a rock crevice during a desert storm. "Lieutenant Davis," she addressed the officer directly, her voice steady and clear. "My name is Eliza Carter. This man is Thomas Carter, my uncle, not my father. 3 days ago, he forced me from his wagon at gunpoint and abandoned me in the desert, saying, and I quote, 'The Apaches can have you. One less mouth to feed.'" Her uncle's face contorted with rage and fear. She's confused, traumatized by her captivity. This Apache has filled her head with lies. "I was rescued, not captured," Eliza continued, ignoring the interruption. "Nakohe found me near death from exposure and thirst. He provided food, water, medicine for my injured feet, and safe passage. Without his intervention, I would certainly have died, which was precisely my uncle's intention." Lieutenant Davis looked discomfited by this direct contradiction of the story he'd been pursuing. "Miss Carter, these are serious allegations. Why would your uncle abandon his own kin?" "Because she's worthless," Thomas Carter exploded, alcohol and frustration breaking through his facade. "Eating my food for 3 years, too plain to marry off, too weak for proper work." The unintended confession silenced the room. Carter realized his error too late, his face draining of color as he registered the horrified expressions of the soldiers. "That's not what I meant," he backpedaled desperately. "She's twisting my words." "I believe we've heard enough, Captain," Wheeler interjected calmly. "Lieutenant, it seems you've been misled about the nature of this situation." The young officer shifted uncomfortably, clearly reassessing his position. "Perhaps, but that doesn't explain the presence of an Apache warrior off the reservation in territory where 2 bounty hunters were recently shot. Self-defense, Nakohe stated flatly, speaking for the first time since entering the room. They fired first, seeking the army's blood money. El Cuervo stepped forward then, his dark eyes fixed on Nakohe with an expression that mingled hatred and something more complex, perhaps regret. "The Apache speaks truth about the bounty hunters," he confirmed surprisingly. "I read the sign. They set an ambush that failed." This unexpected support from his former blood brother seemed to momentarily disarm Nakohe. Lieutenant Davis looked increasingly uncertain, his clean-cut military worldview crumbling in the face of frontier complexity. "The girl's welfare is my primary concern," he declared, seeking firm ground. "Regardless of how she came to be here, she cannot remain in the company of irregular settlements and renegade Apache. I am not a child to be disposed of at the Army's convenience," Eliza stated firmly. "I am 14 years old. On the frontier, girls my age are considered women. They marry, manage households, bear children. I claim the right to determine my own path forward." Her declaration hung in the room, powerful in its simplicity and conviction. In that moment, Eliza hardly recognized herself, the timid, obedient girl who had spent years enduring her uncle's. Cruelty had vanished, replaced by someone stronger, someone unwilling to be a passive recipient of others' decisions. Lieutenant Davis studied her with new respect, then glanced at her uncle's crumpled form. The contrast between their presentations, stark and revealing. "The Army cannot simply leave a young white woman in such irregular circumstances," he maintained, though with noticeably less conviction. "Perhaps a compromise," Captain Wheeler suggested smoothly. "Miss Carter remains with us under my personal protection as a ward of our community. Should she wish to leave when she reaches 16, the army can arrange appropriate placement in a more conventional situation. The solution offered the lieutenant a dignified retreat from an increasingly untenable position. After a moment's consideration, he nodded briskly. Acceptable, provided she writes a statement confirming her circumstances and choices. His gaze hardened as it fell on Thomas Carter. As for you, sir, false statements to army personnel constitutes a serious offense. You'll return with us to Fort Sagebrush to address these charges. Carter's face collapsed in panic. You can't believe this ungrateful girl over her own blood. She's been bewitched by savages and outsiders. Enough. The lieutenant's patience had clearly reached its limit. Corporal, secure this man for transport. As one of the soldiers moved to restrain her uncle, Eliza felt a strange calm settle over her. Not joy or vindication, but something more profound, the quiet certainty that her life had pivoted irreversibly toward a new path of her own choosing. She glanced at Nakohe, finding him locked in silent communion with El Cuervo. Decades of shared history, betrayal, and loss passing between them in a single charged look. Whatever lay between these former blood brothers remained unresolved, but for this moment at least, they had found common ground in truth-telling. Captain Wheeler approached Eliza as the soldiers prepared to depart with her ranting uncle in tow. "The Valley community will welcome you," he said quietly, "but I won't pretend the path will be easy. We live outside society's norms by necessity and choice. Each resident contributes according to their abilities and adapts to our ways. After surviving abandonment and crossing Apache territory," Eliza replied, with newfound confidence, "I believe I can adapt to most anything." Wheeler's weathered face creased in a smile. "I believe you can at that, Miss Carter. I believe you can indeed." As Lieutenant Davis and his patrol departed with her uncle securely bound to his saddle, Eliza stood in the doorway of the sentry post, watching the man who had cast her aside being led away to face consequences of his own making. The symmetry felt right, not as revenge, but as the natural balancing of scales too long weighted against her. She had entered Apache territory as an abandoned child. She would leave it as a young woman who had found her voice, her courage, and perhaps most importantly, her worth. The journey to Wheeler's Valley took 2 days of careful travel through terrain that grew increasingly lush and verdant as they descended from the high ridgelines. Eliza rode behind Sarah on a sturdy pinto mare, while Nakohe traveled on foot with the easy, ground-eating stride that seemed tireless. Captain Wheeler had remained at the sentry post with Miguel, maintaining their vigilant watch on the eastern approaches. "The valley isn't what most outsiders expect," Sarah explained, as they followed a narrow trail that wound between towering pines. "My father chose it precisely because it defies expectations." Eliza had spent the past 2 days processing the confrontation with her uncle and its aftermath. The memory of Thomas Carter being led away by army troopers, his face contorted with impotent rage, had replayed in her mind countless times. Not with satisfaction exactly, but with a sense of justice. Restored. "What should I expect?" she asked, focusing on the future rather than the past. Sarah considered this thoughtfully. "Diversity above all. Navajo families live alongside Mexican traders, a few Apache who, like Nakohe, chose independence over reservation life, half a dozen white settlers who found frontier justice or army protection lacking, even a Chinese man who fled railroad construction and now grows the finest vegetables in the territory. Such a community seemed impossible by everything Eliza had been taught about the territorial conflicts that defined the frontier. Indians and whites living separately was the natural order according to settlement wisdom, segregated by mutual hostility and incompatible ways of life. How do they resolve conflicts, she wondered aloud, with so many different traditions and beliefs? My father established what he calls the circle of voices, Sarah replied. Important decisions affecting the community are made there, with representatives from each group having equal say. It's imperfect, often messy, but far better than alternatives we've seen elsewhere. They made camp that evening beside a small waterfall that spilled into a crystal-clear pool. As Sarah prepared a simple meal, Nakohe disappeared into the surrounding forest, returning an hour later with fresh trout that added welcome variety to their provisions. The Apache warrior had been unusually quiet since the confrontation at the sentry post. His encounter with El Cuervo seemed to have awakened memories and emotions he preferred to keep buried. Eliza had respected his silence, understanding from her own experience how some wounds required private contemplation. As they ate beside the small fire, Sarah studied Nakohe with evident curiosity. "You've never stayed in the valley longer than a few days before," she observed, "always passing through, trading information, then returning to your solitary travels. Will this time be different?" The question hung in the air, giving voice to something Eliza had wondered but hadn't dared ask. Would Nakohe remain in Wheeler's community, or would he continue his solitary path once she was safely delivered? "The path ahead is unclear," he replied after a thoughtful pause. "For many seasons I have walked alone between worlds by choice. Now circumstances suggest new possibilities." His gaze flickered briefly toward Eliza. So quickly she might have imagined it. The gesture warmed something in her chest, the realization that her presence factored into his considerations. "El Cuervo confirmed your account of the bounty hunters," Sarah noted, changing the subject slightly. "That's significant. Given your history, Joaquin follows his own code," Nakohe acknowledged. "Betrayal of his people didn't erase his commitment to certain truths. The complexity of this relationship, blood brotherhood transformed into bitter enmity, yet retaining threads of mutual respect, fascinated Eliza. The frontier narratives. She had grown up with allowed no such nuance between savage and civilized, between enemy and ally. "Will you tell us what happened between you?" she asked, venturing into territory she had avoided until now. How a blood brother became the army scout against his own people? Nakohe's expression remained impassive, but the firelight revealed subtle tensions in his jaw and around his eyes. For a moment, Eliza thought he would refuse the question. Then, surprisingly, he began to speak. "After the school in Santa Fe, Joaquin and I returned to our peoples, he to his Navajo mother's clan, I to my father's Apache band. We carried knowledge of the white man's ways, believing it would help our people survive the changes sweeping across the territory." He prodded the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling upward into the darkening sky. "When the army's campaigns intensified, we met secretly at ancient trading grounds, sharing information to help our communities avoid the worst conflicts. For 3 summers, this worked well. Then the drought came." Sarah nodded in recognition. "The terrible drought of 68, game vanished, crops failed, the reservation supplies promised by treaty never arrived or were stolen by corrupt agents." Nakohe's voice carried no emotion, yet the weight of memory was evident in each measured word. "My people were starving. Some bands began raiding settlements for food and livestock, not from hatred, but from necessity." Eliza remembered fragments of conversation from that period. Settlers speaking in hushed tones of increased Indian troubles, her father arguing that government failures rather than native savagery drove the conflicts. Joaquin believed cooperation, with the army offered the only path to survival. Nakohe continued. He argued that raids would only bring harsher retaliation. I maintained that submitting to reservation life meant slow death from disease and hunger rather than quick death from bullets. The fundamental disagreement that had fractured their brotherhood became clear, not simple betrayal, but a profound philosophical divergence on how to ensure their people's survival. Joaquin came to my family's camp one night, begging us to surrender before the army launched a new campaign. When my father refused, Joaquin left in anger. Nakohe's knuckles whitened around the stick he held. 3 days later, soldiers surrounded our camp at dawn. My father died defending our family. My mother and many others were forced to the reservation. "And your sister?" Eliza asked softly, remembering the story he had shared earlier. "Shot while running toward the creek, seeking escape." His voice remained steady, though the effort clearly cost him. "I was away hunting, returned to find nothing but ashes and bodies left unburied." The brutality of the frontier experience, so often sanitized in settlement accounts or romanticized in Eastern newspapers, stood starkly revealed in Nakohe's personal tragedy. Not abstract conflict between civilizations, but intimate betrayal resulting in devastated families and severed kinship bonds. "You blamed Joaquin," Sarah surmised, "believed he led the soldiers to your camp." "Not believed, knew." Nakohe's certainty was absolute. He admitted as much when I confronted him months later, said he had tried to save us from ourselves, that some must be sacrificed for many to survive. The philosophy behind such cold calculation was not unfamiliar to Eliza. Her uncle had similarly justified his abandonment of her, one less mouth to feed, one less burden to bear. Individual suffering dismissed in service to some larger pragmatic goal. Yet today he supported your account. "Against the bounty hunters," she observed. "Protected you in his way," Nakohe nodded slowly. "The man contains multitudes like all of us, betrayer and truth-teller, destroyer and preserver." He looked directly at Eliza. "Just as your uncle could discard you in one moment, yet genuinely believe himself your protector in the next." The insight startled her with its perceptiveness. Thomas Carter had indeed seemed to believe his own lies about her kidnapping, had perhaps convinced himself that abandonment had been for her own good, transforming himself from villain to rescuer in his own narrative. "The frontier reveals who people truly are," Sarah reflected, banking the fire for the night. "Strips away pretense and forces choices that expose the core beneath." "And what has it revealed about me?" Eliza asked, suddenly uncertain of her own. Transformation from unwanted burden to independent young woman capable of choosing her own path. Sarah smiled gently. "That remains for you to discover in the days ahead." They reached the valley entrance the following afternoon, a narrow passage between sheer rock walls that opened suddenly into a breathtaking vista of green meadows, scattered groves, and a silver ribbon of river winding through the center. Nestled against the valley's western edge stood the community itself, a collection of structures reflecting diverse building traditions, from adobe to log cabins to what appeared to be traditional hogans and wickiups. "Wheeler's Sanctuary," Sarah announced with evident pride, though most residents simply call it the Valley. As they descended the final slope toward the settlement, figures emerged from various buildings to observe their arrival. Children ran ahead as informal heralds, while adults gathered in a loose semicircle near the central meeting area. Eliza noted the diversity Sarah had described, clothing styles, physical appearances, and demeanors reflecting origins from across the cultural spectrum of the Southwest. A petite Mexican woman with iron-gray hair stepped forward, her sharp eyes taking in the newcomers with keen assessment. "This is Elena Mendoza," Sarah introduced. "She speaks for the circle of voices when my father is absent." "Welcome to our valley," Elena greeted, her accented English precise and formal. "Nakohe we know as friend and occasional visitor. The young woman is new to us." "Eliza Carter," Sarah explained. "Circumstances have led her to seek shelter among us. My father has accepted her as a community ward until she reaches 16. Eleanor's gaze softened slightly as it settled on Eliza. Another child of the frontier's cruelty, yes? We have several such stories here. The simple acknowledgement that her experience, while painful, was not unique, offered surprising comfort. Eliza was neither a pitiable anomaly nor a burden to be resented, but part of a recognized pattern within this unusual community. I hope to contribute, not just receive shelter, she stated, lifting her chin with newfound confidence. A smile touched Elena's weathered face. Good answer, child. Everyone here contributes according to their abilities. First, you rest and heal. Then we discover together what you bring to our circle. The community reception continued with introductions to key residents. Robert Blackwood, a former army sergeant who had married a Navajo woman and now coordinated the valley's defenses. Chen Li, the Chinese gardener whose vegetables were indeed impressive. Consuela Ortiz, who managed the community's small school with children of various backgrounds learning together. Most striking to Eliza was the absence of rigid hierarchy. Leadership appeared distributed among those with relevant skills rather than concentrated in a single authority figure. Captain Wheeler had established the framework, but the community had evolved its own organic structure. "Where will I stay?" she asked, as the formal welcomes concluded and residents returned to their daily activities. "With me for now," Sarah replied. "I have space in my cabin, and you'll need guidance in these early days." Nakohe had remained somewhat apart during the introductions, acknowledging greetings but maintaining his customary reserve. As Sarah led Eliza toward her cabin, the Apache warrior approached them. "You are safe here," he said simply. "Wheeler's people understand outsiders better than most." The statement carried finality that tightened Eliza's chest, the sound of imminent departure. "You're leaving?" she asked, unable to keep disappointment from her voice. "For a time," he confirmed. "There are matters requiring my attention in the mountains." Sarah tactfully moved ahead, giving them a moment of privacy. Eliza struggled to articulate the complicated emotions swirling within her. Gratitude for her rescue, respect for his guidance, and something more difficult to name that had developed during their shared journey. "Will you return?" she asked. Finally, the question that mattered most. Nakohe studied her face with unexpected gentleness. "The valley lies on my regular path. I will return when the moon completes 2 cycles. To check whether I've survived community life?" Eliza attempted humor to mask deeper feelings. "To see what you become," he corrected seriously. "The frightened girl I found by the creek already transforms into someone stronger. That transformation deserves witnessing." The simple statement, acknowledging her growth while expecting further evolution, affected Eliza more powerfully than flowery promises or dramatic declarations might have. Nakohe saw her not as she had been, nor with fixed expectations of what she should become, but as a person in genuine process of becoming. "I'll have much to tell you when you return," she promised. He nodded once, then reached into the small pouch at his waist. From it, he withdrew a carved wooden pendant on a leather cord, a stylized hawk in flight, its wings outstretched in graceful arcs. "Among my people, the hawk represents clear vision and protection," he explained, offering it to her. "It sees both details close at hand and the broader landscape beyond." Eliza accepted the gift with the solemnity it deserved, slipping the cord over her head and feeling the wooden pendant come to rest against her heart. "I have nothing to give in return," she admitted. "You already have," Nakohe replied cryptically. "You reminded me that walking between worlds need not mean walking alone." With that, he stepped back, offering a formal nod that somehow conveyed more respect than any elaborate bow. Without further words, he turned and moved toward the valley entrance, his stride purposeful yet unhurried. Eliza watched him depart with complex emotions, sadness at their separation tempered by faith in his promised return. He had rescued her from certain death, guided her through hostile territory, and ultimately delivered her to a place where she might forge a new life. The debt could never be repaid in full, yet somehow she understood that Nakohe would consider it settled if she simply thrived in the opportunity he had helped create. Sarah rejoined her as Nakohe's figure disappeared into the rocks marking the valley entrance. "He'll return," she said confidently. "Nakohe keeps his promises." "I know," Eliza replied, her hand closing around the carved hawk pendant. "In the meantime, I have much to learn about this place, and about who I'm becoming." Sarah smiled approvingly. "Then let's begin with the practical aspects. The community works on shared responsibility. Everyone contributes to essential tasks regardless of their primary skills." As they walked towards Sarah's cabin, the valley settlement bustled with afternoon activities. Children practiced archery under Blackwood's watchful eye, while women of various cultural backgrounds worked together preparing communal meals. Men repaired irrigation channels, directing river water to Chen Li's extensive gardens. None of it resembled the strict segregation Eliza had been taught was natural and necessary on the frontier. Instead, this unexpected community had found strength in diversity rather than conformity, cooperation rather than conquest. The contrast with her uncle's bitter, isolated homestead could not have been more stark. There, survival had been a grim, joyless struggle against both environment and neighbors. Here, despite the challenges of frontier life, a sense of shared purpose created something that transcended mere survival. Sarah showed Eliza to a small but comfortable room in her cabin. Simple furnishings but clean and welcoming, with a window overlooking the central gathering area. "Rest today," Sarah advised. "Tomorrow you'll begin your introduction to valley routines. Consuela can assess your education level for possible assistance with the children. Elena always needs help with weaving and food preservation. Or perhaps you have skills we haven't yet discovered." The possibilities stretched before Eliza like an unopened book, blank pages awaiting the story she would write herself rather than the narrative others had imposed upon her. "My father taught me reading, writing, and natural sciences," she offered. "My mother showed me household management, basic medicine, and textile work. I'm not exceptional at any of these, but willing to learn whatever proves most useful. Willingness to learn may be the most valuable skill of all," Sarah observed approvingly. "Rest now. Your new life begins with tomorrow's sunrise." Left alone, in her room, Eliza moved to the window, gazing out at the community that had accepted her without reservation or suspicion. Beyond the settlement, the valley's protective ridges rose against the afternoon sky like guardians, natural barriers that had allowed this improbable experiment in coexistence to flourish. She touched the carved hawk pendant resting against her chest, its wooden form warm from contact with her skin. 2 months until Nakohe's return. 2 months to discover what she might become in this sanctuary, so different from anything she had imagined possible. The abandoned girl, left to die on Apache ground, had found not just survival, but the promise of genuine renewal. Not through rescue alone, but through her own courage in facing each challenge the frontier had thrown across her path. Thomas Carter had cast her aside, believing her worthless. Nakohe had seen value where her uncle saw only burden. But most importantly, Eliza herself had discovered strengths hidden beneath years of belittlement and forced subservience. As sunset painted the valley in hues of gold and purple, Eliza Carter stood at the threshold of her new beginning, no longer defined by abandonment, but by the choices and connections that would shape her future. Whatever path unfolded before her, she would walk it with clear eyes and an open heart, carrying the lessons of both suffering and unexpected kindness into the life she would now create for herself. The frontier had indeed revealed who she truly was, not the worthless burden her uncle had declared, but a young woman of remarkable resilience, capable of forging connections across the cultural divides that fractured the territory. In Wheeler's Valley, such talents might prove more valuable than gold. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new relationships, new opportunities to contribute. For tonight, it was enough to have arrived at this improbable sanctuary, to have survived the journey from abandoned victim to self-determined young woman with a place in a community that valued diversity over conformity, cooperation over conquest. Eliza smiled as the first stars appeared above the valley. Thomas Carter had abandoned her to die. Instead, he had inadvertently given her the opportunity to truly live. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.